Hello, this is Megan Sitar. I am the current chair of the ACRL instruction section, and I'm so happy that our conference program planning committee is able to present this wonderful program today. They've been working hard all year on it, and I'd like to extend my thanks for all of the work that they've put into it. As chair, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. One, in addition to this webinar being available as a recording after the program, we do have now a page on the ACRL instruction section website where you can find all of our archived webinars. I'm putting a link to that page in the chat. You can find both the session recordings and the slides from any IS webinar that's presented. So please feel free to use those however you'd like within your organization or in professional groups. They're made freely available at that site. Additionally, I'd like to mention that going forward, we won't have an ACRL instruction section conference program planning committee. With our move to virtual, we no longer see a need to sort of align a conference program with ALA. But we will be continuing to offer webinars throughout the year from all of our various IS committees. To keep on top of those, you'll find them posted to the ILI listserv, but we also have a calendar, which I'm linking to in the chat, where those opportunities for continuing learning will continue to be posted. So with no further ado, I would like to welcome our first set of presenters who will be offering our keynote and turn it over to Raymond Pun and Nicole Cook. Oh, before I do that, questions that you may have for the panelists can be put into the chat and we'll monitor that. We also have a question document that you'll see linked to in the first slide. We will be holding questions to the end and we'll be moderating those. So we'll alternate between, if there are questions in both places, we'll alternate between questions through either of those forums. So I will turn it over to Nicole Cook and Raymond Pun.
Great, thank you, Megan. And I'm Ray Pun. I just wanted to really thank the organizers here, Martha, Ernesto, and others, really for putting this together, their labor and strength and making it happen. And I'm really pleased to join here with Dr. Nicole Cook. Nicole, do you want to say something?
Yes, thank you, Ray. I just want to say thank you to Ernesto and Martha and the committee. As you'll hear from our keynote, Ray and I have been discussing some issues, and so when we saw the opportunity to participate in this webinar, we just thought it was really good fortune. So we're very happy to be here with you today.
Great, and so I am really pleased to see the numbers of attendees here. A lot of friendly and familiar faces from all over the country, that folks I know who are doing good work, and hopefully this will be a great way to start your week since today is Monday. And now, next slide, please. So first we have these sort of major themes we want to discuss. We briefly want to illustrate basically how social justice lens can apply itself to these different categories. And hopefully you'll be able to take back into some of them into your own practice, but also to have conversations with your colleagues, to really reflect back on some of the other talks that are going on, because these are really exciting sessions I see coming up after hours. And so really the idea is to look at social justice lens through instruction, but also like in some of the theories that relate to equity, inclusion, privilege, and diversity. Next slide, please. So first, Nicole and I had this presentation back in November of 2018. And some of you may have been in that webinar. This was sponsored and supported by Choice 360 and Credo Reference. And it was about social justice. How do you integrate social justice in library instruction and create new strategic partnerships? And so this lens really brought us to in this conversation, because we spent a lot of time discussing it back then, but then we wanted to do a follow-up to really address these issues. And it's so critical. Obviously, you'll hear from Nicole and from myself how we take that into consideration from our work. My work right now as an academic librarian at a startup school right now really allows me to focus more on open educational resource and lends itself to equity and so forth. But you'll see in next slide that in my past work, I had mentioned this in the other webinar in November 2018, which can find the recording. It's available in the choice page on YouTube. We look at different areas like white supremacy when I worked as a first-year experienced librarian. This was during summer of 2017, the rise of the incident, the white nationalists in Charlottesville, and how do you integrate that into a workshop. So I had the opportunity to teach and reframe sort of this understanding of white supremacy with summer bridge students who are coming into Fresno State, where I was, and really have an open discussion on access, information, meanings. And if they didn't have access to the content, would they actually know more about what white supremacy is? Something that seemed to be so local on Virginia might have a lot of ramifications affecting throughout the whole country. And why is that? So that was a really great opportunity to talk to a whole bunch of first-year students coming in a summer bridge program. Next slide. So the impetus really came down to this poll. We're not doing this poll for this group, but we did a poll in the webinar, and it basically asked the attendees, and many of you may have presented as well, participated, critical pedagogy, social justice in your library instruction, a yes and no. And then next slide. Turned out to be a very low response number. Actually not response, the response was high, but the numbers were low. It was about 30-ish actually said yes, which was interesting. And then Nicole and I decided to have a follow-up conversation on what can we do to really integrate social justice in instruction to encourage people to start thinking, and hopefully we'll see a more of a focus after this webinar and others that people are doing. Next slide. So one of the things that was really interesting when we saw the call for this ACRL instruction virtual webinar is to think of an activity. And so this is an activity I have done, and some of you might be familiar with it. Unfortunately, due to the interest of time, I wouldn't be able to do it. It's mostly of an in-person conversation. But it's a learning activity that came from really, if you've participated in safe zone trainings for supporting LGBTQ plus groups in your campuses, how do you have conversations where participants are able to discuss certain things but sort of withhold certain content? And so I just wanted to emphasize that this is a really great activity that you can try in your library instruction. It's a great way to have folks not be able to say certain things. So for instance, their background, who they are, where they're coming from, but to talk about things around that. And then of course, these are the two main questions. How does that sort of dominant heteronormative discourse silence some voices while privileging others, and which we'll also talk about later in this presentation? And how does this impact our campus partners and community at large? So I encourage you to look into this, and it's a really great way to segue into that presentation that you might do in your library workshop. And with that, I'll segue over to Nicole. Next slide.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Ray. So what I want to talk a little bit about with you today is how do we as librarians and information professionals and other library workers, how do we get to the place where we can address social justice issues and try and work with our instruction responsibilities through a social justice lens? And so I think this picture follows up nicely with the exercise that Ray just mentioned. I'm sure many of you have seen this picture in its various iterations on the web. And really what it's talking about is the difference between equality and justice. And in other pictures, they talk about liberation, they talk about inclusion in different things. But really what we're getting at is how are we acknowledging our learners and our students and acknowledging and recognizing and celebrating their differences in the instruction that we do with them. And it's this type of consideration that begins to bring us into this social justice lens. And so I just have a very brief, very simple definition of social justice just to make sure that we're all on the same page for the presentation. But this is what we want to start getting into. And, you know, again, I'm talking to us as professionals, right? So you may have a slightly different approach in terms of how you actualize this in your library instruction classrooms and how you deal with students. You know, it depends on what topics you might address. And certainly this is an acknowledgement of one-shot sessions, and how difficult it can be to cover all of the content in addition to thinking about a social justice lens, diversity, equity, inclusion, etc. So this is just to get our juices flowing and just think about how we take on a particular mindset in our teaching. Next slide, please. And so, we've been talking about different topics for our purposes here: equity, diversity, inclusion, social justice, etc. We've been talking about these topics for many years in the profession, right? And so I have other pictures that I didn't include here today. I must have a stack of at least 30 books in my office, and this is not including articles, right, of books that talk about various aspects of diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice. Maybe a decade or so ago, we were really talking more about multiculturalism, right? And now in 2019, we're talking more about critical pedagogy and how we incorporate these things. So this is just to say that, we have been having these conversations, and I think we tend to have really good conversations. We have really deep conversations. We have great programming at our conferences. We have great webinars such as this one. In my role as a faculty member at Illinois, I have great conversations with students in my classroom. But I do think that sometimes we don't get far enough past the discussion. And I think some of it is we don't always know how to implement, some of the concepts and discussions that we have. As I mentioned just previously, there could be timing issues. It could be an issue of not having the right resources at your disposal. But just to kind of point out that there are lots of resources, and part of the work that we need to do with this reflection about our own teaching is figuring out what resources are going to work best for us, how do we get access to them, and how do we actually move from discussion to action, right? So that's also part of this social justice lens, is actually moving into action. So the next slide just came up, and so we're talking a little bit more again about the need for equity, diversity, inclusion, and also social justice inside and outside of the library. And so some of our conversations talk a lot about, well, we need to be social justice advocates for our populations, our marginalized and diverse, and really all of our students and patrons. And so that could be conceived of as our social justice work outside of the library, but we also need social justice inside of the library, inside of our professional ranks. And so just briefly, because this could be a webinar in and of itself, I'm sure a lot of you have heard that our profession is primarily composed of white women, and we have a lot of, I'll say, retention issues about keeping diverse voices in the field. And so when we have these conversations, not only is it important for morale and equity within the ranks, it's important that we have library staffs that represent the populations that we serve. And so if you're familiar with the Diversity Counts report that came out of the ALA Office for Diversity, Outreach, and Literacy Services, they're really emphasizing this point. They're really giving us these numbers. And for example, they say, again, that the field continues not to reflect and perhaps not fully understand all of the communities that we serve. So they say that Latinos compose 16.3% of our population, and that's in the United States. But just 3.1% of credentialed librarians are Latinos, Latinas, Latinx population background. Similarly, African Americans compose 12.6% of the population, but just 5.1% of credentialed librarians are African American, right? And we have similar numbers for Asian and Pacific Islanders, 5% of the population, 2.7% of credentialed librarians. And finally, what was represented in the report, Native American or Indigenous librarians, or population, less than 1% of the population, and just 0.2% of credentialed librarians. So all of this is to say, or to suggest that we need to back up even further when we're talking about social justice in the profession, right? We do need to start looking at our ranks more seriously, and hopefully that will also contribute to the work that we're able to do in our libraries, particularly in instruction. Next slide, please. So another thing that I wanted to mention, and with this I do also really want to highly recommend the book by Dr. Sarah Ahmed, and it's called On Being Included, Racism and Diversity in Institutional Life by Duke University Press. And so Dr. Ahmed's book is, I think, really helpful and accessible in getting us to think about social justice in all of the work that we do, not just in instruction. And so she talks about diversity as happy talk, diversity as commodification, as image management. She talks about paper diversity, this kind of casualization of commitment to diversity, and also institutional passing. And so in the interest of time, really, Dr. Ahmed is talking about what happens when you have a library or other institution that has a lot of diversity on paper, right? So perhaps diversity or social justice is represented in the mission statement, or the strategic plan, or even in some policies. But if that diversity and social justice is not actually enacted on a daily basis, this is what we have as happy talk or paper diversity, right? You have it in theory, but you don't actually have it in practice, right? And there's lots of different reasons for this. I think among the most common reasons, perhaps, are that institutions think that they know that they should have some type of diversity in place. Again, they may not know how to enact the diversity and inclusion, or perhaps they really don't want to, right? They just want to be able to pass that kind of image management, that outside audit, that if someone else were to come in from the outside and say, do you have diversity here in your organization? They could literally point to something and say, yeah, sure, we have it right here. But that could be very different from the day-to-day happenings at any given library or institution. Next slide, please. So I just want to remind us, this particular screen really actually comes from ALSC, which is the Association of Library Services to Children, and this is one of their core competencies that they put out to their members. But I think it's really applicable to all of us in the profession, because one of the things that they talk about frequently is a commitment to client group, and talking about demonstrating a respect for diversity and inclusion. They talk about racism, ethnocentrism, classism, heterosexism, genderism, ableism, and all of the other systems of discrimination and exclusion. So again, these are really important things for us to consider, not only with our patrons, but also for our peers, for our colleagues, for those in the profession along with us. And so ACRL, other divisions also have competencies that say similar things. And so, just reflecting back on some of the professional values, and then again, trying to think about how we actualize them in day-to-day practice. Next slide, please. So I'll leave you with two more concepts, and I'll give it back to Ray. This idea of cultural competence, and this idea of how are we getting to the point where we are actively and excitedly learning about the differences in the cultures of other people. So again, our patrons and also our colleagues, right? And how do we get to the point where this idea that we are merging cultures and merging differences becomes natural and not just something that we do, during a particular month or during a particular session. Similarly, the concept of cultural humility, which you have here on the screen, is really encouraging us to engage in this self-reflection about where we want to be and where we are as professionals. Are we at the point, where we are celebrating differences? Are we at the point where this is reflected in our practice? And if it's not, how do we get there? Is it something else that you can read? Another session you can attend? Is it some type of mentoring or training, etc.? So this idea of humility, that we recognize in ourselves that there's always something for us to learn and ways for us to grow as social justice-minded practitioners. Next slide, please. All right, so with that said, just kind of leaving you in this section with a challenge of sorts. And are you and your organization ready for real talk? Are you ready for difficult conversations, right? Because part of, what we hear in our discussions is that, I'm ready to be socially just in my mindset, in my lens, but perhaps I don't work with people or an organization that shares my readiness and my enthusiasm. And that's real, right? And that's sometimes hard to deal with. And you and the organization have to get to the point where you're ready to talk about really hard topics, right? And that's not always easy to do. Are you ready to be uncomfortable? Again, these conversations can be difficult if they are to lead to some type of growth or change. And I think a really important question, are you willing to defer your comfort, privilege, and your advantage in order to have other people, marginalized, diverse, etc., be able to participate and be included? And are you ready to slow down, change course, and try something new? So again, just to leave you with the notion that teaching and enacting social justice can be a long process. It's really more of an iterative process and requires ongoing work from us. So we're happy to, again, be here today to kind of have this conversation and hopefully get us all to the next steps. So I'll turn it back to Ray.
And
thanks.
Just real quick, this is Ernesto. You have about 2 minutes.
Got it. Next slide. Thank you, Nicole, for that great part of your segment on this presentation. It flows really well with this part I wanted to mention. Wanted to give a shout out to Neil Blogger, who I believe is Hannah Rosier from Duke University. And I want to ask everyone here, have you seen this image before? This is the information privilege adopted by Hannah Rosier, looking into Peggy McIntosh's 1989 essay on white privilege. It's really adapting on this idea of indivisible knapsack. It's on Twitter, and when I saw it November 2018, I was really inspired to really utilize this image to teach my graduate students in education, whether they knew about their own privilege. And next slide. And then, so as a result, I also wanted to show, can you move to, thank you. What you see here is also really important elements and themes that you can really present into your one-shot to have a discussion on equity. And it's really an important idea when we talk about information privilege, that access to information is largely dependent on one's status, one's affiliation, or power. Next slide. And so as a result, I think this gives you an opportunity to have a reflection on what you see. So things, for example, I have a lot of books at home, or my university subscribes to these databases and so forth. But it also reflects back on your institutional context, on your individual context, and how it ties nicely to this notion that I think everyone is talking about, which is the larger issue of white privilege. Next slide, please. So I wanted to segue into this part of the presentation, which is looking at critical race theory. And Nicole, please feel free to jump in if you want to add anything, and the idea of counter story. And so I think it's important that this theory can be a way to be used as a lens to analyze and really hold discussions in your library workshops. So for those who are not familiar, CRT is really largely based on legal scholarship from the 1970s. So they were trying to address how the roles of race and racism are embedded in everyday systems, society, and experiences. And so with that, there comes this counter storytelling to really dismantle those dominant narratives, those voices that are not included in our databases, for example. And it goes back to that exercise we had talked about the impact of silence, right? And what do we do when we think about these sort of discriminatory systems in research, the biases that are happening? And I know many of you are familiar with Dr. Safiya Noble's work, Algorithms of Oppression. These kinds of conversations can have really interesting points for students to reflect, to really understand that there are marginalized groups and their works and their stories not being promoted. How do we use this lens in a way that's meaningful in library instruction? So I think if you maybe using that framework could help you advance the social justice lens from this angle. Next slide, please. So here's an example. Everyone is familiar with Wikipedia. I think this is an example I had talked about before, where we work closely and partnered with different campus groups and really allowed participants to share their experiences to cover on women's topics, because it was supporting and highlighting Women's Her Story Month. But what's interesting is that we had a lot of women of color, the students, coming in and participating and making entries for women's rights in Honduras, to women's freedom of speech in Uzbekistan. These entries that were not included in Wikipedia, which is largely and predominantly written and managed by cis white men. So I think there needs to be sort of a change, and Wikipedia is one way to open that opportunity to allow other stories to be heard, to allow other framework such as CRT to be there. Oh, lost sound. Hopefully you can hear me now. Next slide, please. So here's another theory I wanted to mention, funds of knowledge, theory and practice. Have you heard of this theory before? Why is this important? So feel free to chime in a yes or a no. It's a really interesting theory that I think many folks today I've seen in a lot of presentations really talk about deficit theory, which is looking at students or individuals that are inherently in a disadvantage because of their background. However, the funds of knowledge theory, I think it's a really good educational pedagogy that helps us frame what we do in library instruction. Next slide. So we're considering students' identities and their lived experiences in the research process, the contributions, the strengths that they bring, and how do we utilize that into something that's meaningful and their own stories that helps them advance their own research interests. Next slide. Funds of knowledge theory and practice. Here's a really quick nutshell coming from 2001 from these authors here, refer to the historically accumulated and culturally developed bodies of knowledge and skills essential for household or individual functioning and well-being. So I think the overall goal is to look at understanding and recognizing your students' backgrounds, where they're coming from, right? So for example, students who might might be bilingual, multilingual, can actually, for instance, edit and add contributions in Wikipedia in different languages. And we've done that with international students. They come in with that strength, not as a way for us to see as a deficit because of XYZ misconceptions, and really acknowledging their backgrounds that they can bring into that research process. I think that is a way to really propel these conversations going forward when we're supporting different students with different needs. Next slide. And as a result, I wanted to end at this note. I know we ran over a little bit, just to say that sustainability is a really core issue. It was actually adopted recently by the American Library Association as a core value of librarianship. And so what's great is that it echoes closely to funds of knowledge and other theories that we have mentioned, because I think sustainability affects everybody. It's a grave concern. And I think besides obviously the environmental ones, I'm bringing in climate change, global warming, plastic, water crisis. There's the idea of data. You can include critical thinking, all these experiences that folks that we might not sense, right, from their background, from a scientific lens. Are they doing things differently in terms of recycling? Are they doing different things differently in terms of their own environments being affected? Right? And then you can even connect something that's global, like the United Nations SDG, to local contexts, which can be a whole webinar in itself. But the main goal is that you might want to consider using the lens that were proposed, such as CRT, funds of knowledge, feminist pedagogy, to really break into this interpretation of sustainability in library instruction. And I know hopefully that this will give you some thoughts to think about as we transition to the next presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Next slide.
Okay, I guess I'm up. Good afternoon, and thank you to the committee for this opportunity to share a lesson plan that incorporates social justice issues, attributes, themes, and information literacy instruction. My name is Martha Allen, and I am a research and instruction librarian at St. Louis University. Next slide, please. So the reason why I actually had the opportunity to incorporate social justice into instruction was that an instructor came to me and requested a library visit and needed a lesson plan. As librarians, we often teach sessions at the pleasure of a teaching faculty member, usually revolving around a very specific topic or an assignment. In this particular case, the teaching faculty gave me a tremendous amount of latitude and said that I could use any topic I wanted as long as I highlighted beginning search strategies. I'm personally interested in social justice issues, and especially social justice issues in the ivory tower. Also, as Dr. Cook mentioned, that we papered diversity, our mission statement and our library statements mesh beautifully with social justice. But again, does it, is it put into practice? I'd like to think so. But we are a Catholic Jesuit institution, and of course, our university mission statement is men and women for others for the greater good of God. Also, university student learning outcomes mesh with social justice and information literacy, as I'm sure many of your student learning outcomes do as well. And some of ours are graduates will understand how knowledge is created and shared across forms and contexts. Graduates will identify and apply multiple methods of inquiry to address complex questions, and graduates will understand themselves in solidarity with and for others locally, nationally, and globally. And of course, social justice is a natural fit with the ACRL framework, and I recommend Laura Sanders' article, Connecting Social Justice, Connecting Information Literacy and Social Justice, the how and the why. Next slide, please. So one of my first steps in the process to create this lesson plan included selecting the topic. And I selected Silent Sam because of its ties to higher education, its currency, and its ease in identifying parties of power and privilege. I'm going to give you a very brief history for those of you who are not familiar with Silent Sam. It was a statue installed on the University of North Carolina campus in 1913, sponsored and paid for by the United Daughters of the Confederacy to honor UNC students who left college to fight in the Civil War. The statue has been controversial since the early 1950s, when the campus became integrated, but really came to a head recently in 2017 and 2018. In 2017, the statue was a site for the alternative right protesting the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville, Virginia. And then in 2018.
Martha,
yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. This is Ernesto. We have a few participants saying that your sound is fading in and out. I'm not sure if that's an adjustment on your microphone.
Oh. Okay, I will try and not, is this better?
Yep, I can hear you just fine right now. It just goes in and out briefly for a period of time.
Oh, okay. I'll try to speak more clearly. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
So in 2018, the statue was torn down by counter-protesters saying the statue was a symbol of white supremacy. So from that, once I picked the topic, I selected 3 frames from the ACRL framework and then created objectives for the class. But I would also like to say, in addition to this selected social justice issue, their information literacy instruction has some inherent social justice issues. The issues of access to information, the physical issue of access to information, which of course is where do people find the resources they need, and libraries provide a broad spectrum of voices and perspectives. The social access to information, which is the tendency for people to favor or frequent information influenced by their social groups. And then the third, cognitive access to information, which is the ability to evaluate and ethically use information. So I think just our instruction has these social justice issues with respect to access to information automatically built in, and librarians can provide windows into these issues. Next slide, please. So the frames I used are scholarship is conversation, authority is constructed, and research is inquiry, and they do build upon each other. We start with scholarship is conversation. Who are the people talking about the topic? And these are the people that I refer to as the stakeholders. But then with authorities constructed, how do these stakeholders find their information? What gives them the authority? What makes them the experts in their voices? And where do they publish their voices? Where do they communicate their voices? Do they use traditional information resources? Do they use non-traditional information resources? And then finally, after you do your research, what are the different perspectives that you find? Who has the power? And one of the things I hope to have the students discover is who is their equal representation. Is there parity in the information that is out there, and should there be parity? So how do we translate these issues into concrete activities and artifacts? Next slide, please. So here are my learning outcomes, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to read them, but all the information are documents that are attached at the end of the presentation. And I used a Megan Oakleaf lesson plan template, as well as the Gilchrist outcome structure, which is student will be able to do X in order to do Y. You can see that for scholarship is conversation, we have 3 identified stakeholders. That's what we want. And for authority is constructed, then take those stakeholders and determine where those stakeholders are talking, what kind of information resources they have. And finally, then select 2 artifacts from different stakeholders. It's important to remember, much like this presentation, which is only 15 minutes, that the one shot is a 50-minute class. So you need to keep it forward, moving forward. Next slide, please. So how was this one shot organized? I begin with a flipped classroom. There is a pre-assigned reading for the lesson. It's a brief CNN article with a short video that helps set the stage so students have at least a vague idea what we're going to be doing when we meet. I like to give a quick overview of what the class will entail when this class does meet in terms of setup. I like to review the objectives. I like to review the outcomes as well as the activities. There are 3 interactive activities, 2 small group activities, as well as individual searching. And for example, the concept mapping is where the students identify who's actually talking about the topic. And then once the students identify who's talking about the topic, then we talk about, well, where are they talking and matching them up. And then we'll have some time for individual searching. Throughout the class, there is scaffolding, throwing a little Vygotsky in there, and then of course the 3 frames are constructivist in that Piaget constructivism, in that they build upon each other. And importantly, it's very important to have time to conduct a wrap-up for the session. So next slide, please. So what are some benefits and challenges for this lesson plan? With any flipped classroom and assigned reading before class, you really, it's great when it works because the class can hit the ground running, but you never really know whether students will do the actual reading or not. In this particular case, I've spoken with the teaching faculty, and they are going to give the students 10 minutes at the end of the class before the library visit so they can view the CNN article as a class and watch the video. Because the class needs to move quickly, I made the decision to use paper instead of online concept mapping, because the online concept mapping often requires individual account creation. And although they're so great, I've used BubbleUs in the past and Poplet and MindMap, I just want to make sure that we have the time to go through those two interactive activities and the individual searching. And if we want to save the paper mapping, we can do so and scan it and then upload it to the course management software after the class. The other thing I like to do is give visual examples. So on the worksheets, I will put a few examples on there. So examples for the concept mapping might have things like students, faculty, administration. And for the for the matching, I might have student newspapers, broadcast transcripts, but always leave a blank for stakeholders not listed or for information sources not listed either. And throughout, take the opportunity to reinforce those three frames. Scholarship is conversation, authority is constructed, and research is inquiry. The students need to know who is talking first, then what gives them the expertise to enter into a conversation, and finally, where can they find the conversations? Next slide, please. So the wrap-up points, the wrap-up is really important part of the session because it brings the lesson full circle and back to the setup. It's nice to review the why of the assignment and the importance of the process that the students did in their work that day, as well as future research endeavors. When you review the activities, it's an opportunity to overview the why again, why we did it, and again, tie it back to the framework. And always reinforce where the students can get help. At St. Louis University, we have a robust chat service, a text service, phone, email, and of course the all-important in-person service as well. And I do like to follow up with the teaching faculty after the class to see whether there are any questions, any comments, as well as provide him with more information resources. And then finally, the final call for reflection. What is happening now? And again, review some of those supplementary resources. Because the students during this inquiry part of the activity, of the lesson plan, may find out that there still has been no plan for what to do with the statue. And that the Chancellor of University of North Carolina, Carol Folt, resigned in January of 2019, and she actually has a brand new job, and that job is at University of Southern California. So she, the Chancellor, who is now the President of USC, has left Silent Sam, but now has a new social justice issue to deal with, and that may be another lesson plan, the pay for college admissions scandal. So as you can see, there's no shortage of social justice issues in the academy. Now there's one other thing that I didn't mention that I want to go back to, and that is when I do my initial review and
a minute left, Martha.
Okay, thanks. An introduction and overview of the objectives. I want to make sure that the students have an opportunity to opt out of the lesson plan if they feel it will be a trigger. And then there's also, you have to lay the groundwork down for respectful language of others. And I just want to say that at St. Louis University, our Center for Teaching Excellence has been a very good resource to help teachers and instructors deal with difficult conversations. So I would hope you would have those. Here are examples of the activities. I thank you for your kind attention and happy to answer questions at the end of the session. I just want to end with a quote. I'm co-opting. Brian Stevenson, the author of Just Mercy, says that the opposite of poverty is not wealth, it's justice. So I hope this doesn't sound too corny. The opposite of poverty with information literacy is social justice instruction. Thank you.
Okay, and I think I'm next. Thank you very much to the committee, to Ernesto and to Martha for this, and to ACRL. My name is Sergio Chaparro. I am the Behavioral and Social Sciences Research Librarian at Virginia Commonwealth University. And I'm here to talk about educating for social justice and information advocacy using open access platforms from the southern region of the world. I want to pay attention to the fact that this is a very interesting opportunity for me to talk about my experiences with social justice as a librarian, as an educator, as a researcher in global information policies, and now back as a practitioner in the trenches about information literacy and social justice using open access, particularly open access platforms from the southern part of the world, to educate and amplify the role of social justice in the provision of information services. So, because all of this starts with the premise of let's educate where education is most needed. Next slide, please. My main arguments, and this is not my only work, I owe a lot of these ideas to my colleague, Hilary Miller here, our scholarly communications librarian. The main arguments of this presentation have to do with the fact that if we examine this thoroughly, if we examine this carefully also, open access is in itself a very good example of advocacy and social justice in terms of a platform that is the result of initiatives of this kind. Because we need to pay attention to the fact that inequality still happens to a great degree in the academic and research information arena. And open access, particularly in the southern region of the world, is a remarkable example also of singularity and uniqueness in their development. Like Cielo, for example, it started in 1998, okay? And that was a very, very pioneer initiative of this kind. 13% of all Latin American journals are now open access, with countries like Argentina, Mexico, and my country, Peru, as being pioneers in terms of national laws on open access. Who are leading the pack here? Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, and Mexico. Again, this is not a new thing. It has been happening for a while. The problem is that we need to be we need to voice more emphatically the development of this and the consequences of open access in the southern region of the world to illuminate principles and to illuminate constructs for information development that connect with social justice. Next slide, please. Long are the days of 1, 2, or 3. These are just examples of the multiple open access platforms, diverse themes, diverse topics. For anybody who asks, what is this about? Where is it? what do they talk about? Here is a very, very summarized list of what is available, what happens. These are real examples. Next slide, please. I believe that educating on open access presents an enormous set of opportunities for academic librarians, particularly for information literacy, because that is the area where we can educate faculty, researchers, students on leadership, on information policies, and on research and knowledge that should be connected to social justice using open access. Next slide, please. And this happens with in this slide. This is a work in progress, okay? And I try to come up with research ideas, and I try to come up with things and topics that connect with leadership, information policies, and research and I try to come up with subtopics here: advocacy for visibility, access and sharing, dialogue for inclusion. Let me put one simple example. Open access in the southern region of the world, Cielo, for example, is an enormous example. It's an enormous example of leadership in terms of information development. It's also an amazing lesson on how to lead, how to educate others, how to advocate for a more egalitarian world of information, of information in general. In terms of information policies, educating others about open access also, it makes them pay attention to locally generated research, intellectual output, a lot of the things that Nicole spoke, in the beginning, in the keynote of this set of presentations. Open access allows us now to demand for more inclusive information policies. There is evidence that we need more inclusive information policies to invest and to promote open access. Open access also allows us to educate the scientific community on the role of information policies. How important is that happen in Argentina, Mexico, and Peru, and that enable legislation. In terms of research, open access represents a tremendous opportunity to promote and build quality for inclusion, to disseminate the concept of peer review research, and more importantly, and I can't emphasize that enough on my classes and my conversations with faculty and researchers, the notion of public good was probably not pioneered in the southern region of the world, but there was more consciousness about its value, the value of public good, the fact that science belongs to the public good. Now, correct me, how is this not a social justice issue? Maybe we have an opportunity here to develop best practices about the notion of public good and a notion of equity in information. Next slide, please. The framework, which we are all very much educated on, and again, it's a framework of reference, talks exactly about, there are three constructs here that I think pertain very much to open access. Authority is constructed and contextual, information creation as a process, and scholarship as a conversation. How? Well, authoritative knowledge may be packaged in different ways, and open access, educating about open access may educate us better on that regards. May educate us better also in the building of communities of practice that are more egalitarian. Open access is still an iterative process, so let's look at its evolution, and let's look at how it works to gain lessons for social justice. Open access is also an exceptional space. I'm paying attention to scholarship as a conversation. Open access is an exceptional space and tool for reflecting on our discursive practices, gain new perspectives on topics and themes, examine the role of research and librarians, examine their voices, paying attention to how is that they model and conduct research and how they explain and write about scientific ideas. Next slide, please. you might think, well, how does this translate? Well, it translates directly into the classroom, where through something that happened to us recently here at VCU, that Virginia Commonwealth University Division for Inclusive Excellence gave us, we sent a proposal for a short course entitled "Scholarship is a Global Conversation, Whose Voices Are Left Out." Me and my colleague Hillary, we got the proposal accepted, and now we're in the process of building a class for the fall that is going to discuss, persuade, and argue about all of this. We want to promote activities such as pick your smartphone. How is to do research without a $70,000 database? Martha already talked about this. Nicole spoke about this. You know, we want to enable this. We want to connect and communicate this directly to the students, the researchers, and the faculty. We wanna talk. We wanna explain about how it's not to have access to scientific information, because we also want to emphasize something that we think is missing from the discussion, and it's becoming a little bit convoluted. Open access is not about money, but about equity and inclusion, okay? Yes, we can save money, but that is not the main goal of the existence of open access. Next slide, please. Therefore, we know this is important, okay? We know this is important. This issue, the whole financial issue is important, but we wanna emphasize the next one. Next slide, please. We wanna connect, we wanna educate on the fact that open access is a social justice issue and connects with, for example, sustainable development goals. We wanna work with development, and we're going to have researchers from Latin America talking directly through their WhatsApp or whatever platform we find, directly communicating their thoughts, feelings, and their perceptions of how research is being done. Next slide, please. In addition to all of this, from the point of view of information literacy, there is a lot that we can learn. A very simple search on social justice on Cielo, for example, brings 1,982 results of several different areas, several different perspectives. So this is evident not only from the perception about open access, but also the applicability of open access in the classroom through several different classes. It is my job to educate. I have made a commitment here at VCU to, in the following year, I support the education and psychology departments. I want to educate everybody about open access platforms, include them in information literacy using these kind of ideas, this kind of perceptions. Also, we want through these examples, we want to, educate in this classroom about whose voices are missing. I mean, and I borrow here from Tara Robertson, who is in the room, who is at the table, who speaks a lot, who has social capital, who is sitting on the margins, and this could be a great opportunity. But again, the idea is to translate all of these directly into information literacy in the following months. Next slide, please. Challenges remain. Yes, I mean, and for those of you connected to open access, these quotes are not unfamiliar. Okay, we are aware of the challenges, but my main response to this kind of quotes, this kind of ideas, is that how can we improve if we are not given a chance to improve? Thank you, Ernesto. This is about cultural humility. We are aware of these challenges. Okay, next slide, please. Despite all of this, there is recognition that open access in the southern regions of the world is bringing tremendous contributions, okay? And VCU wants, to connect social justice with information advocacy and to place this in information literacy to make this a more thorough and holistic experience about information platforms and their impact on information literacy. We are hoping to have this class set up in this direction, and you're going to hear from us in the future. I can guarantee you. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jason Ezel with Lucy Rosenblum, and we're librarians at Loyola University, New Orleans. And we want to thank you all for coming to this portion of the presentation, listening to our part, which will focus on digital mapping and the process, as we call it, of placing gay liberation where you are. Next slide, please. So we want to start with a little bit of a group brainstorm, and you can just type your answer into the chat box if you would. What is the name of one site important to the history of gay liberation as you know it? Next slide, please. So I would imagine that it's quite natural for many of us to answer with Stonewall, and that would be an important answer to include. But as with many historical events, a certain site or maybe two can become emblematic of richer historical change. Like when political events are linked to such emblematic places, the conditions and the agents of that change can become increasingly dehistoricized, and questions such as those of scale, context, and duration are then lost. So whole geographies and their populations can become understood as simply either inside or outside of that particular political scope. So as a result, whole regions are rendered, at least in the public imagination, as holding no political potential whatsoever, and it's often thought of as a matter of their very natures. For example, in these red-blue state maps that we've become familiar with, it's less common for us to say something like a particular state, say that Texas is implementing certain types of conservative policies, than to say a state is conservative. So it's part of just who they are or who that place is. So when people think of themselves as being from or of or in these places, their sense of their own activist potential is somehow diminished. And so in Louisiana, a few of our own students are from the blue states on this map. And that results in many of our students considering their context as hopelessly conservative or oppressive. Next slide, please. In LGBTQ plus studies, such limiting political geographies have been critiqued in a number of different ways. So for example, you have what Jack Halberstam refers to as metronormativity. You have what Scott Herring refers to as a bicoastalism. You have what Jasbir Puar has referred to as a homonationalism. And maybe most relevant to what Lucy and I are talking about today, you have what Henry Abeloff has referred to as a kind of myth of the Stonewall story. So in this quote, Abeloff says that gay lib's whole mental world, its ideas, values, attitudes, confusions, aspirations, has in effect been lost in the Stonewall story. So here we have an example of an extremely important, iconic location that's important to remember, but the fact of the name of the location itself can sometimes cloud the actual agents and the processes and strategies of important social justice change. So how can these geographical assumptions can make social justice activism feel impossible in some places and overly complete maybe in others, depending on where you are. So how can we as educators and librarians mitigate this problem of political geography? Next slide, please. So Lucy and I collaborated on instruction design to address this very issue. We chose a new course called Beyond Stonewall, Histories of U.S. Gay Liberation, that I was teaching as the primary instructor. The course was part of our honors program at a Jesuit university, similar to what Martha was talking about earlier, as also being part of a Jesuit university. The honors program itself is expected to reflect social justice values, and the description of one learning objective for that program says that students should learn to, quote, lead meaningful lives with and for others and to work for a more just world. So I, as a researcher of LGBTQ plus history and as our library's history liaison, I really wanted to introduce students to the historical context of gay liberation and to some of the main modes of inquiry. In Lucy's role as the political science liaison, our systems librarian, and as a specialist in mapping from our digital scholarship team, she suggested and taught us different modes of scholarly output to fit the political insights that we hope to offer our students through our library sessions and our course assignments. Next slide, please. So we designed the learning to take the students through a three-step process. We first hoped that to focus on discovering primary sources which might help us to extend traditional US LGBTQ+ movement historiography. Second, we wanted them to map that uncharted history in such a way that invited the students to situate, narrate, and potentially personalize that history. And third, to reflect on what a composite class map could tell us in terms of finding unexpected gaps, overlaps, and concentrations in the movement history. So this is the path we hope to take take students through in the process of having them find themselves in geographies of social justice potential. Next slide, please. So a couple elements of the framework were embedded in our instructional design, as I hope you can see from this prompt for the mapping assignment. In yellow, you can see how components of the information creation process, in this case, for example, consulting sources, developing a thesis, supporting arguments with evidence, these parts of the information creation process that we typically associate with the traditional research paper format can also be sewn into the emerging format of the story map. And that new emerging format would help us to tease out geographic, narrative, and phenomenological inquiry for the students. In green, we also emphasize by simply requiring the students to name themselves as authors of a project that is available on the web, that students begin to develop a sense of their own authority, both within a scholarly and a social justice context. So next, I'll hand it off to Lucy, who will describe our two library sessions. Next slide, please.
Great, thank you, Jason. So before the first library session, students read Mark Stein as a way to classify different types of LGBTQ+ movements. And we began the session by showing a clip from the documentary Screaming Queens to demonstrate a historian exploring the archives. In the opening to this documentary, transgender historian Susan Stryker depicts first learning of an event of transgender liberation, which was documented in some of the newspapers housed in the archives, an event that occurred prior to Stonewall and on the opposite side of the country. So in the documentary, the rest of the story grows out of this moment of Stryker really discovering herself in the archive. After we showed the clip, students then mirrored Stryker's process by exploring Gale's Archives of Sexuality and Gender, which contains digitized materials from archives around the country. By the end of the session, students completed a primary source analysis worksheet to deepen the initial discovery of one document that piqued their interest. And we found that many of the students selected a document related to their hometown, indicating one way that maybe they were beginning to place themselves in the story of the LGBTQ+ movements. Next slide, please. So the focus of the second library instruction session was getting into the mindset of thinking spatially. So first I wrote a set of questions on the board used in geography. Where, why there, and why do we care? I provided example maps and asked students to identify the narrative being mapped by each author. And so after they had a chance to practice reading maps on these sort of unfamiliar and unrelated topics, the students were then asked to think about the spatial elements of their own research in order to identify key sites. And in the last portion of the session, I introduced the mapping tool that they would be using for their assignment. Next slide. So now I'm going to jump into the specifics of two free mapping tools that we used with this course. I'd like to ask you to think of 3 important sites to your own life history. And again, you won't have to put this in the comments or anything. This is just to sort of get you thinking. Next slide. So the first mapping tool, StoryMap.js, is a free tool from the Knight Lab at Northwestern University. And as we move through this tool overview, imagine now how you might plot the sites from your own life that you came up with just now during the brainstorming exercise. So this is the backend user interface for StoryMap.js. As a demonstration, I've outlined each step in red, and I've used the university where Jason and I work, Loyola in New Orleans, as sort of the example point that I'm plotting. And I like to describe the interface as a combination of PowerPoint and Google Maps as far as how you sort of utilize it. So for each site, the map creator adds a slide, and then they designate a geographical point on the map to place a marker for that site. Each site is named, and then there's space to add text and media to give context. The format of this tool focuses on both time and place. So in addition to just placing sites on the map, the sites also must be given a sequential order by the map creator to convey a narrative. And that's sort of where the slide function comes in. You order the slides. And that's the main reason that we selected this tool for the assignment when we were kind of comparing potential free mapping tools that were available. Next slide, please. So these are screen captures from an interactive story map. I've selected the map of a student who researched a 1973 arson that killed 32 people at a New Orleans gay bar. The map overview, which is labeled here as screenshot number 1, acts as a title slide. So it displays the student's thesis and a zoomed out view of all the sites that they selected to tell the story of the fire at the upstairs lounge. This view of the map that includes all sites, it tells us something unexpected. So you'll see that one site is far from the rest, St. George Episcopal Church. And so it asks the viewer looking at the map to leave the French Quarter, which is sort of the part of New Orleans more commonly known as the center of the gay community, and go uptown. So a person viewing this map clicks on the arrows to navigate back and forth, and it zooms into each site in the order of the story. And the upstairs lounge story has, until recently, been archived, resulting in its being left out of a lot more of the mainstream histories. And so what's neat about this project is it gives a student as an author the opportunity to bring this lesser known story to public light because this map is published on the web. And so they can really share the results of their research and hopefully sort of spread the story with the general public. Next slide, please. So after the students each completed their individual maps, I created an additional class map that combined all of their sites. For this part, I used Google's custom mapping tool. Next slide, please. So Google My Maps allows you to plot a large set of location in Google Maps from a spreadsheet. So each row in the spreadsheet represents one point on the map. And for this project, I first added columns to the spreadsheet to combine certain pieces of information from the 13 student projects. The information I thought would be important on the class map was student names and the title of their individual maps, for example. And there are two pieces of data that have to be included as columns in the spreadsheet for the tool to work. So you have to include geographical information, which is either an address or latitude and longitude coordinates, and a title for each site. So I uploaded the completed spreadsheet to Google My Maps, and then the points are all plotted. And so you'll see in the screenshot number 3, when you click on one of the points, all the information from the spreadsheet columns is displayed alongside the point on the map. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, here is the completed class map that's published online. When able to view a composite map like this of each other's work, students are able to discover circulations, intersections, and gaps in the research, which are connections that individual papers wouldn't have necessarily uncovered. And in addition, anyone, just sort of general public, coming to this collection of research can place themselves on the map and, as a result, see themselves connected in some way to a social justice movement. Alrighty, so on the next 2 slides, we list our references, and I want to thank you for listening to our presentation, and we look forward to any questions.
This is back to Megan. Thank you so much, Lucy and Jason. We really appreciate you sharing that information. So I'm going to take questions from both the chat as well as the document if you prefer to add your questions there. I'll start off with a question from the chat for Lucy, from Laura. How did the students locate the articles that they used on their maps?
Let's see, I'll flip back to, well, actually, I'll share the slides later. The first library session where we focus on primary source discovery, one thing that I highlighted when talking about searching Gale's primary source archive was specifically in archives of sexuality and gender. One of the advanced search options is narrowing it down by the archive that contributed the material. And so I sort of focused on that so you could see a list of all the different kinds of organizations and archives from around the country that had contributed documents. And so that was sort of one way to, you know, if they saw a name of a place in one of the organization titles, they could narrow it down, sort of got into questions of like collection scope of those organizations too. So we gave them, basically the most important part was sort of just giving them the time to explore.
Great, thank you. For Dr. Cook, this was, you responded to this earlier in the chat, but the question, I'm hoping you can maybe reprise your response for those who missed it. The question was, what unique roles might librarians and libraries play in institutional conversations about inclusivity and diversity?
Sure, thank you. I'm trying to remember what I typed in the box, but just, I think there are lots of ways to do it. And I think, you know, we as professionals can work to find the ways that work best for us. But some examples are, you know, the things that you heard in the other presentations, the great examples about picking a topic and bringing that to your instruction class, or even inviting other diverse or marginalized voices, experts to your classes, or you know, just assigning different videos or works by diverse authors, right? So just kind of highlighting the voice. And so I think it's not always about us saying, okay, we're going to do social justice for an hour, but it's part of making it natural and just incorporating those sources that demonstrate your commitment to social justice.
Thank you very much. Back to Lucy. So it was possible that students could bump into the same article, which would be plotted more than once in that assignment?
Yeah, and we thought about, so this was the first time that we did this course, and we're going to do it again in the fall. And so we definitely kind of considered that and thought maybe even instead of starting with a fresh map for the next group of students doing the class, that was sort of one thing that we thought might be interesting to see all the overlaps, and maybe even have this map as something that we continue to add to. So it wouldn't just be each semester's class, but it would be students moving forward. And then, you know, there would be more likely to be overlaps, but I think that that sort of is part of the what the map can offer that maybe the individual papers didn't, was where there are gaps and where there are overlaps. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Any other additional questions? You could put them into the chat. I'll wait 30 more seconds. Okay, so as you can see on the screen, there is a request for feedback on this session. It's a quick little assessment, but it will help us in not just planning future programs on this topic, but sharing what approaches that we took in presenting this information was useful to you that we can share with other planning groups across the section. Unless there are any additional questions, I'll just remind you again to please take that very quick survey. And thank you to all of our presenters and the committee for putting together a wonderful program today. Thank you.